So just here before I get started on what God has put on my heart to share with you, just an update on the proposed trip that I was supposed to be leaving on in 2 weeks today to Cuba. We received notice from the Cuban leaders themselves who are planning our itinerary at that end that it was best not to come. They actually asked us not to come completely because resources, and particularly in fuel, as well as food supplies, are extremely short. Getting around would not be a guaranteed thing. We would be faced with possible days where we'd have enough fuel to start the day and maybe not enough fuel to get back. I've been in those situations before. I am okay with it, but they would rather their words is we need to conserve what limited resources we have right now for the use of our local pastors and missionaries that travel around that live there, and we couldn't be in more full agreement with that. The downside is all the things that we've collected, and I just want to thank this church for its tremendous generosity. I have 2 suitcases, and one is virtually full already, and there's a significant cash donations that have come in as well. I'm hoping right now that the trip is only on hold, and that there may be, Lord willing, some kind of change in the situation in Cuba. Would require change with somebody who lives south of the border of us, who seems to think he controls the world and is doing his best to do that. There needs to be a change in that area before things will actually change in Cuba, which is a big ask. But I invite you to pray for that. Pray for those changes. And pray for our Cuban brothers and sisters. I'm keenly aware when I've made my trips in there, and I've gone in any number of times now. We go in for a week, and we endure whatever is there, okay? They always live there. That is 24/7, what they live under, those kinds of conditions and those kinds of situations. And they desperately need our encouragement, as is prayed and has been said here before. Things that we just take for granted that are just normal things, pain medications that you can go into any drugstore, actually any supermarket and buy, are simply not available. Hygiene products, simply not available. And then sometimes when they are, they're exorbitantly priced and they can't afford them anyway. So what we take in, the downside of not being able to go, is all the things that those of us on the team, and I'm the only one coming out of the west, but others are coming out of the east, are unable to bring those things in. So as you think about it, remember our brothers and sisters in Cuba as they live there. I've never thought of Cuba necessarily as a holiday spot, because when I go in there, I don't know if I could go there with all full integrity and be there on vacation. But let me say, it's got some beautiful beaches and beautiful places. And the Cuban people are so tremendously hospitable. But one of our favorite holiday spots over the years has been the Oregon coast. We used to travel down there kind of regularly. We've camped up and down the coast. We don't go there anymore until things change south of the border. This is a particular location that we would go. It's Cannon Beach. It's a little town called Cannon Beach. When we first started going there in the 70s, it was just like a sleepy little, I'm going to call it a sleepy little hippie, artsy-fartsy kind of town. That there were no big hotels. There were little mom and pop motel operations, and we would get a place that was right on the beach, and with a kitchenette, and we just loved going there. Summers were great. We had a fascination with going there in wintertime. I know it seems strange to go someplace in wintertime, but I was driving bus over here, so I tried to get time off in December because it's crazy around here with all the shopping going on. And we'd take a week or 2 weeks, and we'd go down there, and we loved to sit and just watch the winter storms blow in. There's this lighthouse there. It's called Terrible Tilly. It has a story in itself that I'll sometimes incorporate in one of my sermons and talk to you about. But these storms just kind of blow in. I reaped the consequences of not taking into consideration the power of the wind one time we went down. I had an old, I think it was about a 63, 64 Chevy Nova. that I picked up, couldn't afford anything else. It was a bit of a rattle-trap car. Somebody had done a lot of touch-up paint on it. You know how it is, so you could see where things are. I parked the car, came out the next day after one of these storms had blown in, and I realized that I'd parked broadside to the wind. And the whole side of the car was sanded down because it blew all the sand up there and it was sanded right down to where the person had just put primer on. There's powerful winds there. I do a number on the you can see the effects up and down as you drive up and down the coast. You see the very rugged shores and how the trees have been bent and changed, and olives are changed to resist those things, and they seem to survive in the kind of craziest territory. These trees are just growing out of solid rock. And it just totally, it's kind of like nature's bonsai. You know, how it just kind of picks it apart, and trees that would normally be really tall but they're so interesting and just take on a different shape, and they become very hardy. The wood becomes very rock hard. Calvin Miller, in his book called The Unchained Soul, says this. He says, Scottish patriarchs, looking for walking sticks, always passed the untried wood of the lower slopes. They climbed instead to the weathered heights to search for rods made strong by storm and wind. These iron-strong canes were once young trees that fought the icy northers. And with each storm, they bent and twisted and broke a bit inside. But gradually, each inner scar became the steely fiber that they bought with every storm endured. Tough times in our lives, times of hardship and suffering, are a lot like that. They have a way of doing the same thing in our lives, forging in us what I would call a real-world faith. And that is what we've been looking at, and we're going to look at today what that means as we continue in our series that we're calling Forging a Real Faith. That is a faith that will stand up to the test and the pressures and the stress of the real world outside the comfortable security of our churches, the walls of our churches, and our homes. Faith that stands up to the everyday pressures of the world out there. That is a faith that is a street-level faith. Faith that encounters the brokenness and confronts and engages in the brokenness of the world in which we live. The homeless man sleeping in the doorstep of a building on your way to work or in the back alley. The faith, where we hear and tune out because we hear them so often, the sirens of ambulances and fire trucks and police cars on their way to yet another overdose or an accident or a fire or the scene of a crime that's taken place. The world where as we kind of go through the SkyTrain station as we got off and kind of head out and kind of hold our nose as we go along because we can smell the urine and the body odor of somebody who hasn't bathed for a pretty long time. The world where so many, perhaps including some of us, pretends to have it all together, while at home marriages are falling apart, children are going their own way and refusing to comply with standards that have been set for them. The world where we show up on the job and we have the pressures to bend the rules, to be less than honest in various aspects of our work so it would benefit our employer. But it's a world where a soft and passive and untested faith will inevitably be ineffective and will too easily fall apart or run and hide someplace and not make any difference. So God, in order for us to become more effective for his work that he's called us to do, what he's called us to participate, forges in us a faith that will be able to stand up to the pushback of the real world where we live and work and play so much of our life. And he does that through a number of experiences that we would rather avoid if we're really totally honest. We'd rather not go through these experiences, but they become vitally necessary if we are to develop a real world faith. They're not experiences that we go seeking after. but they're experiences that we're invited to embrace, not in a masochistic kind of, woe is me kind of suffering kind of way, but to learn from them and to allow them to change who we are. I've adopted the term forge simply because it indicates a process that those experiences take us through, that they heat up our lives throughout this process, and then we feel like sometimes we just get hammered on by them. But it's a process, I believe, that is necessary in order to shape us into the people that God wants us to be, to engage in the good works that the Bible tells us, Paul tells us that he prepared for us a long time ago to do. So last week we looked at how we can grow through failure, and in fact how failure is an important step to developing that kind of real-world faith, to forging that kind of real-world faith. And we looked at the example of Peter's experience, a man who was self-confident and strong and came across as he had it all together and had to learn that he needed to learn to depend on God instead of his own sense of his abilities, his own character strength. So today I want to lean into the experience of another strong man, Paul, another person we would consider to be a giant of the faith. And so he was. But he also had to go through some very tough experiences in his life that shaped and strengthened his faith and formed in him the person that God could work through in a very powerful way. And sometimes we set out to emulate the faith of these giants, these men and women who we see as giants of the faith, and we want to be like them. But we fail to realize that they didn't become who they were overnight. They weren't just born that way. They became that way through a lifetime of experiences that shaped and molded in them their character and their faith. What we see is often the end of their then product of all those experiences, of whose faith that has been already forged through the fiery furnace of adversity and affliction and the pounding on the anvil of life. Well, the text we'll be looking at today comes out of Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. But again, it's worth noting here that how he comes across in this letter is already a result of part of the process of God's transforming work in his life, which has continued throughout his life. The Paul we read in some of his early writings is just a hard-nosed, kind of hard-hitting Paul. By the time we're getting to the last books that he wrote, among them are books like Philippians, we see a much more gentle, compassionate character coming through, who's been through a lot of different experiences along the way. And those experiences have changed him into who he is. So who is this Paul? What do we know about him? Well, Paul was born into an elite family, an elite Jewish Pharisee family. And as such, he was well educated, took pride in his education, his training. He had trained under the greatly respected Rabbi Gamaliel. He was a man of strong character and zealous for God to a fault. And at one point, he was convinced that Jesus was a false Messiah who had misled his followers and who he saw both in Jesus and them as threats to the purity of their Jewish faith, the Jewish religion. And so he set out on a personal mission to eliminate them, to take care of that, and to get rid of that. He thought he was serving God, very zealously he was serving God for that reason. But in the middle of that time, he had this dramatic encounter with God, this dramatic encounter with the living Jesus, where he is literally knocked off his horse and found himself needing to call on one of the very followers of Jesus to come pray for him for his own healing. Would have been a very humbling experience indeed for Paul to have gone through that kind of process. Also probably a very frightening experience for him because he was no longer in control. He needed somebody else. He was blinded. He needed somebody to lead him. He was not in control of his life at that point. But his life was deeply transformed by that experience. And he became as passionate for Jesus as he had been against him. But his character still needed some work. He needed to be changed in his character as well. And that is true for all of us. Nobody comes along and pushes the delete button on you just because you become a follower of Jesus. You bring everything you were before you had that commitment of faith and that invitation of Jesus to become part of life. You bring all of that in. And Jesus says, yeah, come just as you are. You don't have to clean up your life. You don't have to clean house before the cleaning lady comes in. Just bring the whole thing and he says, let me clean it up and let me help change you. And that takes time. It takes the transforming work of the Holy Spirit in his lives, and that was the case with Paul. And like I say, we can see that process taking place as we read through his letters that he writes. So while he writes this his second letter that we have to the Corinthians, it gives us a window into some of that journey of transformation that is taking place and how his faith is being forged along the way through some tough experiences that taught him to start trusting more in God and not in his own abilities and not in his own character. Learning not to rely on himself, but rather on God. He begins the letter by simply saying, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Notice, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. And in my Bible, I circle all. Who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. He sees this as God's work in his life to mold him into somebody who can bring that same level of comfort to others because he's experienced it. Now later in this whole book, and I don't have the scripture up there, but I'm going to read it for you. He lists some of those troubles, some of those experiences he's been through. When you get to chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, he says, I have been in prison more frequently. I've been flogged severely. I've been exposed to death again and again. 5 times, he says, I received from the Jews the 40 lashes -1, which was kind of like the maximum sentence. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I have spent the night and day in open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers. I have been in danger from bandits. I've been in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, you begin to get the picture, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and I've been naked. It's this accumulated experiences of Paul, these hardships that have forged in him and forged in us a real world faith. And that was Paul's experience. So how is that for a resume? As some of you are reluctant to go on a missions trip with me, how would you like to go on a missions trip with Paul? These experiences, at least in part, are what he probably has in mind when he writes what was read to us earlier. We do not want you to be uninformed. In other words, the Corinthians thought he was a strong person. They just kind of minimized some of the things that he had maybe been through. He says, I don't want you to be uninformed, brothers. This is about the troubles. And the word there for troubles is the worst kind of problems. In the book of Revelation, that same word is translated as tribulation. It's like deep, painful troubles that we experienced in the province of Asia. He says, we were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. What he wants his readers to know is that when he talks about experiencing the comfort of God, the God of all comfort and who comforts us in all our troubles, he's not speaking hypothetically. He's not speaking or simply offering like a little spiritual platitude here that God is there for you. He's speaking from personal experience. And he's speaking from personal experience not only of God's comfort, but also of some pretty severe experiences of hardship and suffering that he's been through. Notice how he qualifies those experiences. Far beyond our ability to endure. Pushed to the limit. Figure like there's nothing, he has nothing more. The next thing is going to be the end. We despaired of life itself. Talks about deep depression. A lot of problems going on here. We felt we had received the sentence of death. These are the words of someone who is barely holding on. Not exactly what we would expect to hear from someone like Paul, is it? He is often in our minds, and no doubt was to those in the first century Christians in Corinth, the epitome of strength. One who was solid and strong in character and fearless in his behavior and passionate about being on mission for Jesus. So have you been there? In a place where you find yourself just kind of holding on? You don't have to have gone through all these experiences, because what I've discovered is that our experiences and our response to them is always unique to us. It's always relative to where we are in life. So relative to what we've experienced up until that time. And it's the accumulation of these experiences that begins to forge in us a real world faith. And I believe that was Paul's experience. He writes next, he says, but this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. We begin to see the same pattern as we saw in Peter last week. A very different kind of experiences, but with the same effect and results. A shift from self-reliance to a reliance on God. As one commentator puts it, severe crises have a way of putting life and our limited resources into perspective like nothing else can. That is because no matter how strong we think we are, in the words of Paul a bit later on in this letter, he says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay. Now, the word picture that Paul uses here comes from a common aspect of their everyday lives. These were clay jars that every home had for very mundane purposes around the house. You know, from hauling out garbage to bringing in water, from carrying different things in that you might need. They were jars that just had very common uses. There's an ordinariness that Paul is trying to communicate about you and me in terms of the treasure, in contrast to the treasure of God's work in our lives that we have compared to the ordinariness of who we are. They were affordable and disposable and put a wide variety of common uses. If these jars were chipped or cracked or broken, they were thrown away. But God does not see us as disposable. If we fail to live up to the standard, he doesn't throw us away. Paul also says, even when we are unfaithful, he is faithful. He reworks us into becoming stronger through those experiences, through the process of experience. Now, I said Leonard Cohen is one of my favorite singers. I find his lyrics at times incomprehensible. But every once in a while in some of his songs, he has lyrics that really impact me. And one of his songs called Anthem, he says, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Sometimes there needs to be a crack in your life for the light to get in. And I would add that it's also how the light gets out through the cracks that are in our lives. And our faith, when the light gets out, become a beacon of hope to others who are going through similar experiences or their own hardships and times of suffering. A real world faith, first and foremost, is a faith that relies on God, not on ourselves. Relies on God regardless of the outcome, because we're not promised that everything's going to work out the way we would like it to work out. Paul writes, he says, but this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God. And I think the very fact that he has to write that tells me that at some point in his life, especially when he's first starting out, that he tended to rely a whole lot on his own abilities and his own character. Remember, Paul's a strong guy. He's strong-minded and he's forceful. He had to learn that he needed to rely on God who raises the dead, he said. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. So part of God's transforming work in our lives, through our experience of hardship and suffering, is also an invitation to share in the suffering of Jesus himself for the brokenness of the world. Right at the beginning of his letter, when Paul writes about the God of all comfort experiences comfort, he talks about sharing in those experiences, sharing in the sufferings of Jesus. He says, for just as the sufferings of Christ flow over our lives, so also through Christ our comfort overflows. We can't give away what we haven't experienced ourselves. Sometimes we need to go through those experiences where we need that kind of comfort, that kind of experience of God's presence in life before we can begin to pass that on to others. See, God invites us to share in the sufferings of Jesus, to be broken in our hearts and our lives for that which breaks his heart. Can I just put in a plug for going on a short-term mission trip? Doesn't have to be with me. But to take some of your vacation time, and instead of going to someplace exotic where you stay in a 5-star hotel, probably eat the same food that you eat at home, you can save yourself airfare and check into a downtown hotel and experience the same thing. Go someplace else. Go someplace where you can see and experience firsthand how much of the rest of the world lives. Over half this world, probably up to 80%, live by completely different standards than you and I enjoy or experience here. What comes to my mind is some of the places I've been. I had the privilege of going to with a family to serve, to help put in a kitchen in a favela in Rio de Janeiro that was basically one of the worst favelas there. Was controlled by drug lords. You didn't go in there without permission. It was a crazy place to be. We were welcome because we were doing something for the community. It became more dangerous when the police showed up, because that's when the bullets start flying. And we experienced that as well. In fact, many of the casualties aren't the targets, but are from bullets that just happen to get in the way. These kids that play in that street, most of them have born there, will live their life out there, will never leave there. A half an hour drive from there is one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, the Ipanema Beach in Rio de Janeiro. They will never make it there. My dream, and I understand that in a successive trips later on they did this, is to get a bus, load these kids up, and take them to Ipanema Beach. Because they can't imagine a different world than the one that they live in every day. It just doesn't enter that. There's other possibilities to life than what they experience. Happy kids. But I remember taking a break from work and sitting on the curb outside the church. And whenever I did that, the kids would gather around, and there was this one little girl who could have been more than about 5 or 6. She would always come and want to sit on my lap. It smelled like urine. We've been foster parents. Those are usually indications of sexual abuse or there's abuse that's taken place in her life. All she wanted to experience was some healthy love and affection. That was close to 20 years ago. I often wonder what has become of her life. I hope that I could have communicated to her by just being there with her, putting my arm around her, holding her, that she was loved and worthy of being loved. That there was a God who cared for her and loved her. But the point I want to make here, and I don't want you to lose touch with this, is that it's not until our hearts are broken for the brokenness of others in this world, that we will truly begin to forge real faith that gets out of our comfort zone and says we can make a difference for them. It's not until you are in that kind of situation where you experience that firsthand and you allow that to break your heart that you can make a difference. Paul writes in Philippians 3:10, 11, and these for me have become my life verses. I want to know Christ. By that he says, the word for know there is want to have this intimate relationship. I want to know Christ. And the power is the resurrection. Who doesn't want to experience the power of Jesus, the resurrection at work in our lives? Paul says, you have the same power. We have the same power at work in our lives that raised Jesus from the dead. We run around on our little battery-operated power, and we can be supercharged. And the fellowship of sharing in its sufferings. The word fellowship there has become a misleading and misused term in our day. So fellowship here does not mean food fun with friends. The word that's translated fellowship in our Bibles means partnership, means engaging shoulder to shoulder in an activity with somebody else. That's why we need to know, experience the power of the resurrection, at least in our Jesus, because he's inviting us to share, and by that I mean participate in his sufferings, becoming like him, he says, in his death. I mean, just laying it all on the line. And then so somehow to attain to the resurrection from the dead. That was Paul's life aim, and I've tried to make it mine as well. I want to know Jesus in a personal way, such that I have him at work in my life in such a way I make a difference in the world by not insulating or isolating myself from the brokenness of the world, but you get down into the trenches, into the ditches, where we are so much needed. Jesus invites us to partner with him in his mission in the world, but that will call on us to experience the same brokenness that he experiences. Our problem is, if we're totally and ruthlessly honest with ourselves, we go to great lengths to avoid that. We go to great lengths to isolate and insulate ourselves, to live in our safe and secure, stable environments. And we not only want to isolate us from our own experience of hardship and suffering, but that of the world around us. So brothers and sisters, friends, it's time to drop the guard. It's time to step out. Get out of those comfortable zones and begin to look for ways that God wants to work in your life. And to come into that kind of brokenness of experience, because that's how God forges in each one of us a real world faith, a faith that isn't just this passive thing that we proclaim and gather together. This is great. We need times of worship because it refocuses our life. And when we're out in the world around us, it's easy to get unfocused. And we need times of worship and times to gather together. But then we need to go out back into the world with a faith that's going to make a difference out there. So one more thing I want to bring out here before I close, from what Paul writes to the text that we've been looking at today. And that is this. And I believe this is also something that we find really tough, real hard. I want to push you on this one, okay? And that is, Paul has this openness and willingness to be vulnerable to people who saw him as being the strong person. I speak to you as your pastor. I've been a pastor for, I guess it's 35, 36 years now. And what I realize is a lot of people, and I'm not saying this applies to you, but I've experienced this, they want the pastor to be kind of up next to God. You know, be the strong person who doesn't have any faults and failures. But here's the reality. I'm just a clay jar, like you. I struggle with the same things you do. I wrestle with the same things you do. We need to be open about our lives. And Diana and I have chosen, that's our approach to ministry. What you see is what you get. We don't come with the perfect family. We have a son who got into drugs early in life and died of an overdose about 8 years ago. We have a daughter who love her to bits, but isn't walking with God. We wrestle with the same things you do. We've experienced all kinds of different things, and I'm not going to start listing because this isn't about me. Paul says, I don't want you to be uninformed. I don't want you to think that I'm immune to these things, that I don't go through it. Here's what I've gone through, and he's not looking for them to engage in a pity party for him. That's not what anybody wants. That's unproductive. Rather, he is inviting them to walk with him through those experiences and to keep him not only in their hearts and thoughts, but also in their prayers. He says, he, that is God, has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us as you help us by your prayers. To me, prayer is a mystery. But we're invited to engage in it. And when we engage in prayer, we're joining God in what he's doing in other places in the world. And we begin to walk with people. That's why we should be praying for our Cuban brothers and sisters, the ones in Venezuela that we have contact with, because we, as a church, have a connection with a couple of churches there. But other places, things are really bad in Iran. We need to have our hearts broken so that we engage in praying for those people, and then being open to being part of the answer to their prayers, where God says, taps you on the shoulder and says, I think I want you to go and be an personal encouragement to somebody there. Then Paul says, many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many. Here's the thing. When we are open with others about what we are experiencing, we're saying to them, this is who I am. This is what I'm going through right now. Hold me up in your prayers. Walk with me through this experience. And allow me to walk with you through your experiences. So when we learn to be open about what we're experiencing, those kind of things that we're going through that are not so pleasant, that often we want to cover up and we don't want to share, we may even feel embarrassed to share them. We are giving permission to somebody else to be open with us. As we invite other people to walk with us through those experiences, we're also saying we're willing to walk with them through the same thing. We need to walk together as a community with each other. When we do that, we open up ourselves to receive the support that we so much need in those times. But we are also inviting others to experience God at work through their prayers. And by so doing, we are part of forging the experience in them about forging a real world faith. Because there's nothing like seeing God work. Even when you didn't necessarily, you prayed and you didn't even necessarily expect to see anything. My first trip to Cuba, we went as a vision mission trip, and we just went around and we prayed for people. We were invited to pray for healing. I remember this one lady that was brought to us and said she's suffering from cancer. The doctor said it's terminal. Would you pray for her? I will confess, I pray for people, but in my mind I'm thinking, I don't know if this works. You're the same way, are you not? So it blew me out of the water. When next year we went back, and they come and says, hey, do you know that lady you prayed for? She's healed. Blew me out of the water. I thought, that was not my faith. That was just simply God working, asking God to work. We invite people when we begin to become part of them forging a real world faith. So as we close our service today, I'm wondering, I'm asking, what is it that you are going through right now in your life? however great it might seem, or even how insignificant or small it might seem, that you need to share with us so that we can walk together with you through this time. In our last trip to Casa Luz, we had the enjoyment and the privilege of being part of two different services that took place at the church that was right around the corner from where we were staying. Templo de la Hermosa, and Pastor Daniel there was there. Our team, to a person, as we debriefed from it, was moved and touched by the spirit of worship that was there, for one thing, the expressiveness. Latinos are expressive anyway. But there was something else, because they never closed the service without inviting people to come forward for prayer if they need something, regardless of what the service was about. And they never lacked for people coming forward and saying, I need you to pray for me. I have asked this in past, and I suspect that we here are reluctant to respond, sometimes because you want to keep something private. Probably sometimes because you're not sure what somebody else is going to think about you. But here's what happens when you do that. Number one, you cheat yourself out of an experience of God working in your life. You're not opening yourself up to experience that. But can I say this? You cheat others from being part of that experience too. So, I'm asking you, I'm going to ask the worship team to come up here and get ready to close. If you need someone to pray for you, I will stay at the front. And I know we have all kinds of community time, and that's great. And I'm sure there's others here I know, because I know people personally, who would be willing to pray for you. There's no shame, no embarrassment. Can I say, this is what I'm going through right now. Would you pray for me? And I would love to do that for you. I'm sure the others would love to do that for you. So we're going to sing our closing song. It talks about God's changing us from the inside out. Part of that inside out change is come to terms with who we are, what we're working through. We so often, you know what, we hear God stories. And when do we hear the God stories? At the other end, when victory's been had. I've sat where you're sitting. I've heard those stories. I've heard the stories that somebody talks about how tremendously God worked in their son's life or their daughter's life to bring them back. And part of me says, I hope, I have a desperate hope that is my experience. And then another part of me says, that's not what I'm experiencing. What's wrong with me? We need to share in each other's lives before we have the tremendous hallelujah God story to share, so that we can walk with each other through that experience regardless of how it turns out. So stand as we sing the closing song. I'm going to come up and close in prayer. I'm going to stay at the front. But perhaps even as we sing, you want to come up. I would welcome you to come up. I'll be here.